the web to tune that out, because there's a lot of aspects of this that come into play, both on the care side and on the detection side, that I think all of us can be aware of. I know that certain entities are used to working with victims, and it's easy to be myopic and just focus in on their immediate needs. But if you are in a care role with victims after they've been recovered or after they are transitioning out of being trafficked, it is important for you to know what may be going on in the legal process of a case that they're involved in, so that you can help prepare them for that. I can't tell you how many times care providers and NGOs and advocates have helped victims be prepared and help them through the legal process when they're part of a criminal case. So I think it's really good for everyone to know what's going on the prosecution side and on the investigation side, and how that may impact the people that we're helping. The second half of this presentation, the second half of the presentation is going to talk about the team that I work on. I was really lucky to get the opportunity to come and head up the Texas Attorney General's human trafficking team, and we're going to introduce the team members and explain all the different services that we have, so that all of you all are aware of that, and maybe we can find ways to work together and network and partner in the future. Okay, so here's a little bit about me. As Andrea mentioned, I was Assistant United States Attorney in the Northern District of Texas. I officed out of the Dallas office. I prosecuted cases in Dallas, Fort Worth, and Wichita Falls, and I worked there for 12 years. Prior to that, I worked at a law firm and did civil practice, primarily federal law civil practice, for 5 years, and I clerked for a federal judge in Dallas before that. When I got to the U.S. Attorney's Office, my main goal was to help kids. I became a prosecutor because I wanted to help children, and I wasn't sure. I knew that federal courts had various ways of doing that, and I originally thought that the best way for me to do that would be to work child exploitation and online type cases, which is a very worthy pursuit. But I had an opportunity pretty early on in my prosecutorial career to get involved in human trafficking. And I didn't know a lot about trafficking when I got into it. I had this misconception that human trafficking was more like human smuggling. And I didn't realize how many children are trafficked, both domestically, or both domestic kids and international children here in the United States. And so as I got into the practice, excuse me, I realized that this is an excellent way to help kids and women and all sorts of exploited people in our country. And I loved the practice. So I was the human trafficking coordinator in Dallas for 9 years. In that role, I had the opportunity to work with the North Texas Trafficking Task Force, which is made up of federal, state, and local law enforcement. We also had a portion of the task force where we worked with local NGOs. And it was a great and eye-opening experience to walk into that environment and see how much partnership and how much people really do work together on this issue. For people who've worked in law enforcement in the past, there are sometimes turf wars over certain types of cases. Drug cases are the ones I can think of in particular, where the Dallas Police Narcotics Unit and DEA may be looking at the same target, and they may butt heads on issues like that. Whereas human trafficking, I've never experienced that. It's one of those things that it's an all hands on deck situation from the beginning to the end, and people really want to work together, and that was very inspiring. In my career in the Northern District of Texas, I prosecuted over 50 human trafficking defendants. Another passion of mine that the governor's office and the Texas AG's office is very involved in has to do with gangs. I have always been interested in gangs and organized crime activity in the state of Texas, and I was pretty surprised to learn how many of the defendants I was investigating and prosecuting were documented gang members. I think another kind of misconception that I had was, especially when it comes to sex trafficking, there was a pimp and a victim, maybe two victims. And I didn't realize how often there's so much more to the story than that. And so I was both surprised and then eventually not surprised that about 75% of the defendants that I prosecuted while I was in the Northern District of Texas were gang members. I saw a trend of people who used to be involved in drug trafficking becoming more sophisticated criminals and moving into human trafficking because it was easier to get away with. It was harder to detect, and it was easier to get away with. And I learned some of this from talking to defendants over the years, and they would say, yes, if I got stopped by a police officer, with a kilo of cocaine in my car, I was going to jail. If I got stopped by that same police officer with a 15-year-old girl in my car, nothing was going to happen to me. And so they started realizing that the risk for them was much less. And also, if when you buy drugs, it's dangerous. And when you resell drugs, it's dangerous. There's lots of robberies and shootings and violence related to that. And so the more sophisticated criminals were realizing all I have to do is recruit a girl or a group of girls and women, and they're the ones who are in the danger. I stick them in a hotel room, or I have them walk the track, and the customers, if anybody gets hurt, it's going to be them. They're the ones who will get arrested. They're the ones who may get robbed or hurt by the customers. The traffickers nowhere around. So that, coupled with the fact that in the sex trafficking context in particular, you can use victims over and over and over again. They can be sold many, many times a day, whereas once you run out of drugs, you have to go buy more. And so that was an interesting sort of realization for me. I primarily prosecuted adult and child sex trafficking cases. There were some labor trafficking cases that came through my office while I was there, but the timing of one of them, I have 2-year-old twins, and a really great labor trafficking case was brought by the State Department while I was there, and it happened to hit right when I was pregnant with my twins, so I wasn't able to be involved in that case. But I did have several human trafficking trials, and they were a big experience. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So I'm going to talk about the things I learned during investigations that I think people might find interesting, as well as pretrial considerations and sentencing considerations. First, when it comes to investigations, the natural inclination for law enforcement is to identify a witness or a victim and do a thorough interview the minute that you meet them. That does not work well in human trafficking cases. Oftentimes, when you are pulling someone out of being trafficked, whether it's sex trafficked or labor trafficked, they are in a bad emotional state. They are not in a healthy state. They may or may not be on drugs. They may not have eaten. And they oftentimes are in a sort of perpetual state of fight or flight. So law enforcement, to fight the urge to do in-depth interviews with victims the day that they are recovered, ask the immediate necessity emergency questions that you need to find out. Are there any other victims there? Is there anything active right now that we have to deal with immediately? And then let them be taken care of. Make sure that they get medical attention. Make sure that they have appropriate clothing and food and water. I know that sounds kind of basic, but it is almost, when you find a trafficking victim, they are in a state in which they are usually very dependent on their trafficker for all the things I just described. So they may not advocate for themselves initially on saying, I haven't eaten in 3 days, or can I go to sleep? Things like that. So when you encounter them as law enforcement and as on-scene service providers, take care of their basic needs first, and then go back and start interviewing them. It may take several interviews to get the complete story of a trafficking case. That does not mean that the victims are being purposely evasive. Oftentimes, victims who are exposed to long-time trauma don't necessarily know what day it is, what time it is. Some of them don't know what city they're in when they are first recovered. So I know some really experienced law enforcement officers in the past have thought that victims were being purposefully evasive with them when they talked to them once and then they had a whole lot more to their story the next time. That has more to do with the trauma response and the way that your body and your brain reacts to trauma. And so do not be discouraged if you feel like a victim is holding back or not telling you everything. Take a break, go back another time and try again. But that being said, on the trial side, sometimes it will require someone explaining why it took 3 or 4 times to get the whole story. And that can easily be done, but just be aware of that as you're dealing with putting together and making sure you have a good timeline of the trafficking situation. One thing I can't stress enough, especially with child sex trafficking victims, is how important it is to gain their trust. That is true for anyone who is involved in helping them with their recovery. So often, when children are victimized, they don't always come from bad family situations, but they often do. And in those instances, adults their whole life have let them down. So it is important that the adults that come into contact with them after they've been trafficked are consistent. They are professional. They do what they say they're going to do. They show up. They don't push too hard with victims because victims almost expect people to let them down because that's what's happened to them their whole lives in a lot of cases, especially those who may be foster kids. So it's very important if, let's say you have a victim that's in a long-term mental health facility and you go to visit that victim. If you find out that her favorite drink is Dr. Pepper and you tell her next time I see you, I'm going to bring you a Dr. Pepper, bring her the Dr. Pepper. If you say we're going to meet next Tuesday, show up next Tuesday. Don't do it on Wednesday, do it on Tuesday. Those little things, that's what victims are watching for. They're watching to see if you do what you say you're going to do, and that is how you develop that trust. And that trust is very important going forward in the investigative and prosecution process. If they don't trust you, they are not as likely to cooperate or to be fully honest with you. I cannot stress how important it is to have good relationships with your local advocates and service providers for victims. So often that their advocate is their lifeline. And there's so many wonderful charities in the state of Texas. I can't tell you how many. And in a little bit, I'll talk about how we're working on trying to devise, I think, in addition to the governor's office, trying to devise a list of all of the service care providers in the state that's easily accessible for people. That's in the works. And there are tons of y'all out there. But make sure that you have victim services on hand. And if you don't have them on hand, get them there. And that can involve making sure you have people that speak the right language, making sure you have people, if there are cultural issues in play, make sure you're culturally sensitive to who you bring in to provide victim advocacy. That can make a huge difference, both in the experience of the victim and in the success of any case that may go forward. One thing I've had the weird and unique opportunity to do is to speak to a lot of traffickers. In federal prosecutions, oftentimes we will have meetings where the prosecutor and law enforcement will meet with the defendant and their defense team. And part of those meetings will be, we call them show and tell or reverse proffers. And we will be presenting the evidence we have against the trafficker so that they can make a decision on whether they want to plead or go to trial. And also after that, once they've decided to plead guilty, traffickers will often sit down with law enforcement and me to proffer and tell us about their business, basically. And in those situations, one of the first things I say to traffickers is, this is not a he said, she said case like you think it is, because so many traffickers think there's no way that anyone's going to believe this victim. They're nothing. They're not believable. So I always tell them, I trust what victims tell me, and then I verify what they say. And so sometimes the stories that will come out of victims' mouths sound unbelievable, but in those cases, at least in my experience, we've always been able to verify what they say. But don't just take a victim's word for it. Help support what they say, so that if it does get to a trial situation, it is not a he said, she said. And you take away that argument from the defense that you just have to believe everything that this girl says, because it becomes a personal attack on the victim. And usually along the way, there are going to be corroborating things out there that will help bolster their testimony. In sex trafficking cases, what are those? If they stayed at hotels, get hotel records. And they may not be in the trafficker's name. They're usually not in the victim's name, but try to figure out what rooms they were in. Oftentimes, in several cases, we've actually had video from the front desk of the trafficker checking in with the victim. And that's great evidence. Everybody loves a video. And in those videos, there's one in particular I can think of on a Fort Worth case I did with HSI, where one of our victims was a cute little blonde, but she dyed her hair blue. And you can see her standing there, and she just looks so young. She's kind of dancing around and stuff in the lobby, and she looks like a kid. And so that was great evidence in that particular defendant's trial. Look for online commercial sex ads. Look for travel records. The very nature, especially of sex trafficking, is movement. Victims get picked up or recruited one place, and they move them all around. Sometimes they move them all around the state. Sometimes they move them all around the United States. But when victims travel, there are often records of that. If you are law enforcement and you go into a hotel room, document everything that you see. Take pictures of all of the room. Take pictures of any sex-related items, condoms, used condoms, anything that can help corroborate what took place in that room. In labor trafficking cases, as we always say, both sex trafficking and labor trafficking happen in plain sight. But labor trafficking cases, you want to look for some different things that can be telltale signs of this. Oftentimes, people will come to the U.S. thinking they may have even signed an employment contract. Either that employment contract is not at all honored, or it is very unfair to the employee from the beginning. But either way, try to get those contracts. Things like whether or not the contract is in English, but the person only speaks Chinese or only speaks Mandarin. Or we have a civil case right now where there were employment contracts, but the people only spoke Spanish and the contracts were only provided to them in English. Those sorts of disparities are important in labor trafficking cases. Travel documents, visa and immigration documents, sometimes those visa and immigration documents can be signs of visa fraud. Sometimes it's, where are your travel documents, when you ask a victim and they say, oh, my trafficker has them. The fact that an employer is holding someone's travel documents or identifying documents and not giving them back is a good sign of labor trafficking, and that's good evidence in a case. Payment records, to the extent that they have them, or lack of payment is also important. In domestic servitude cases where people will come from another country and come and live in someone's home, there's often promises by the employer / trafficker that I'm going to send money to your family back in your native country. And trying to verify whether any money was sent, and if it was, how much, can be important evidence in those cases. Evidence of living conditions. Often traffickers will require, or basically require, that their employees / victims live together in a certain place. If you run across that, document the conditions. How many people are living in a place? Is it clean? Is it sanitary? Do they have access to hot and cold water, access to refrigerators, things like that? That can be important. And also, and this is also true for sex trafficking cases, interview people the victims may have come into contact with that maybe would have noticed something strange. In sex trafficking cases, ask the front desk clerk about that trafficker. How often does he or she come here? Do you see them with people? What do the people look like that you see them with? Same with labor trafficking. If they're working in a business and the trafficking victims may come into contact with the public, see if you can find anyone in the public that can comment on that, or other employees who could describe working conditions, living conditions. There are certain labor trafficking situations where one subset of employees is being trafficked and another isn't. Those employees that are free to come and go and are being compensated fairly, they may have opinions and may be able to describe how the other set were being treated. I've mentioned this before, but I had a misconception that most traffickers worked alone when I started doing this. And I learned that's just not the case. Many traffickers are working in groups, whether that's organized crime type groups, gang affiliations, Asian organized crime, or whether it's familial. Especially in sex trafficking, I've found many instances where there's multi-generational pimps. I had a case where there was a grandmother who was running a storefront brothel in Richardson, Texas, which is a suburb of Dallas. The grandmother owned the storefront brothel, and the granddaughter managed it. They also had a great aunt that worked the front desk of the brothel as well. So it's, I guess, like anything else, in some instances, trafficking, pimping can be a family business. So fight the urge to just look at the one victim in front of you and the one trafficker or two traffickers you've identified of that victim. Ask more questions, ask about others, look for records and documents. I know in sex trafficking cases, pimps will often go to the same 2 or 3 hotels. So don't just pull hotel records for the week you knew our victim was there. Pull every time that person's ever stayed there for the last year, and you may find a lot more of that type of activity. Bottom girls. So in human trafficking cases, a pimp's main girl is often called a bottom girl, and it's a misnomer because when you think of bottom, you think of the lowest rung on the ladder. But in the human trafficking world, a bottom girl is actually a pimp's primary, you could say primary victim or primary main girl. Bottom girls are oftentimes adults, not always. They tend to be with pimps the longest. They are viewed the most loyal to the pimp. And in some instances, bottom girls were maybe victims at some point and no longer are victims. In some instances, they remain victims. Certain pimps will assault, control, and demean the bottom girl more than anybody else in their organization, especially in cases where they are trafficking young 15, 14-year-old girls. They will beat the bottom girl in front of the other girls to keep them in line. From a prosecutorial perspective and an investigative perspective, it can be challenging to figure out how to treat a bottom girl. The last thing that I want to do if she is a true victim is put her in jail. That being said, oftentimes a lot of the evidence in the case supports her being a co-conspirator or a co-trafficker. So part of what I try to do before we arrest people in the case is to try, if you have the luxury of doing this, is to try to ask victims and other people involved in the case how the bottom girl was treated to start getting an idea of whether or not she's a victim. But in lots of cases, bottom girls are arrested on the front end, and then over time, they will come to the realization, and the investigators will come to the realization that they were a victim. And sometimes it takes that arrest and that time away from the trafficker and off of drugs and out of that sort of traumatic situation to get them to the point where they are victims. We've actually been pretty successful in cases where we've originally charged bottom girls where they've received services. They get put on probation and then they receive services. They get their GEDs, they get drug treatment, and they get things that they need from the system to get out and move on. So one thing I learned about charging decisions in cases was it's good to charge, if you have multiple victims, to charge a trafficker for every victim that you can prove the case, because human trafficking cases often sit in the system for years, and sometimes you lose victims, whether that you can't find them anymore, whether that we had a victim, unfortunately, in a HSI case I had that got murdered during the trial, during the pendency of the trial. And if she was our only charged victim in that case, her trafficker could have gone free. Charge as many victims as you have that you can prove. And the other thing I always recommend is to at least consider charging cases that, to the extent that they're a felon that gets caught with a gun, or they get caught in possession of drugs when they're arrested, or, as happens a lot, especially in child sex trafficking cases, they may have created child pornography and or possessed child pornography. Consider charging those cases as well, so that if there is an instance where the victim cannot participate in trial for whatever reason, you have fallback charges that don't require the victim's participation. Along the same lines, I created a practice of, any chance I could, putting my victim and having them tell their story in grand jury prior to indictment. I did that for a couple of reasons. First, that's a less intimidating environment for a victim than going into court with the big high ceilings, the judge sitting up high, and all the strangers in the room, and the defendant in the room. It has them practice telling their story. We are able to establish a timeline of what happens, and it's in a more controlled environment. It also creates a grand jury transcript. Those transcripts are very helpful in convincing traffickers to plead. Most traffickers, whether they're sex traffickers or labor traffickers, at the end of the day believe that they control that victim, and that victim will never show up to testify against them. So part of that tactic is to say, not only did he or she show up, but here's his sworn testimony against you, and here's what he said. He did it once, he's going to do it again at trial. One thing I have learned, though, is telling that story that way it can create a trauma situation for the victim. So in instances, whenever I can, I try to have a victim advocate there, a victim coordinator, somebody or a family member there to support them during that process. In state cases, we often have, I'm blanking on it, where we have forensic interviews, video forensic interviews. And in trafficking cases, I have mixed feelings about those, depending on the trafficking situation with the victim. In some instances, those are very successful and they go well. In some instances, the victims, because they've been exposed to extended sexual-based trauma, they kind of shut down in those forensic interviews. If that happens, it happens. And obviously that's going to get turned over in discovery, but we just start again. We try to do it a different way, a different time, and to get that interview done. There are a lot of DA's offices that require forensic interviews especially victims, I think, are under the age of 14. And so if they don't work or if they don't go well and the victim shuts down, don't give up. We can try again in a different environment. One thing that really stands out to me about human trafficking cases is witness tampering. The nature of the control that traffickers have over their victims, it permeates the entire judicial process. So they believe that they can control those victims even from jail. Witness tampering doesn't always come in the form of, hey, I'm going to kill you. If you talk, I'm going to kill you and your family. Sometimes it does. Witness tampering can also come in the form of getting a different person that's worked for that trafficker to go and contact the victim. It can show up in the form of guilt. If you testify against her, what's going to happen to her children? Or, we're a family. I thought we were a family. I don't understand why you're going against the family. Those kind of arguments. So sometimes they're overtly threatening, and sometimes they're more another effort of mind control. When it happens, address it. If the system does not address witness tampering, it will continue to happen. Witness tampering can take lots of forms: threats, guilt trips, lies about love. In the sex trafficking context, I equate a pimp's recruitment of victims similar to the way gangs recruit members. Why do young people join gangs? What are they looking for? They're looking for somewhere to belong. They're looking for family. The same thing, those same arguments and manipulations can be used by traffickers to get victims to come work with them. But with that whole family mentality and we're all together, flip that around when it seems like you're going against the family, and that can really impact victims. Find ways to prevent it. One thing I found, especially in today's social media craze, everybody wants everyone to know what they're doing and where they are all of the time. The problem with social media is that if, number one, from a safety perspective, we don't want traffickers and people affiliated with them knowing where our victims are at any given time. And also, they may have common friends. So even if the victim unfriends the bottom girl, the other victims that may have been there, and the trafficker, they may have common friends where they can still be seen. So I know it's hard telling people to limit their social media, but I tell them to limit their social media, and certainly don't live stream or check in places or tell people where you are. Another thing, depending on the extent of the witness tampering and violent threats, oftentimes it's best to relocate victims entirely out of the town where they were recruited, where they normally live. That's not always possible, but if you are looking for a placement situation for a victim, maybe they need long-term counseling or drug counseling, mental health services, sometimes it's best to look a few towns away or even in another state. It's a lot harder to go and try to tamper with a witness if you have to drive to the other side of Texas or drive to Oklahoma. One thing I always tell people, if you are being tampered with or if you feel threatened or unsafe, call 911 first if it's an immediate concern. If it's not an immediate concern, if it's somebody sending you messages and things, I always ask them to screenshot and don't respond, and screenshot the communications, keep voicemails, keep all of that, and send that to your victim advocate and or your investigator so that we can specifically address those things. Because we can add additional witness tampering charges, and we can also, if the person's on bond and they're doing this, that can impact their bond conditions. One other thing I will say about witness tampering, it happens a lot, and it is allowed to be used as evidence of guilt, consciousness of guilt. So if you are actively, once a case is filed or you know that you're under investigation, trying to convince people to change their story or not talk to law enforcement, that information can be offered at their trial to show in part that they are guilty. So the more we can document that, the better. One thing I know I experienced in Dallas, and I'm not sure if this is true for criminal judges elsewhere, is that a lot of judges are not familiar with the unique aspects of human trafficking cases. I know on the federal side, they didn't deal with a lot of crimes against person cases, and they didn't deal with a lot of sex-based cases. And so the rape shield law was new to a lot of judges. And so it's important for us as prosecutors and law enforcement to make sure the judges know about the rape shield law, about ways to protect the victims, and what's required to protect victims during the court process. Also, there are certain areas of the law that can help protect a victim from being personally attacked on the stand about certain things, and we want to make sure that that does not happen in the presence of the jury. One thing that is an option, especially I think with younger victims, is use of things like therapy dogs during trial. I have not ever done that, but I know that recently a federal law was passed that permits that in certain situations, and it's definitely something to think about. But don't spring that on the court at the last minute. If you want to try to utilize a therapy dog. I also had a case where I had a young victim, and I filed briefing ahead of time, and she was allowed to testify via teleconference from another room in the courthouse. So the defendant could still see her, and she could still see what was going on in the courtroom, but she didn't have to be in the same room. And we were allowed to do that during the trial. So if you have issues like that, bring it up ahead of time and brief it well for the judge to give them all the information they need to hopefully support what you're asking for. So you get to trial and sentencing. Recognize for victims how scary it is to testify. Recognize that for all witnesses, but I think as prosecutors, we often think, oh, we're used to dealing with cops who testify all the time. Normal people and victims are not used to that, and it is scary. This is when we circle back around to how important it is that victim trusts you. What I do when I'm given this opportunity, if the victim is local or I'm able to get him or her there before trial, I get permission from the judge to either show them the courtroom when no one's in there, or if the judge is having docket, I bring with an advocate, me, probably a law enforcement officer, and the victim, and we just let the victim watch what happens in court and watch that particular judge and watch just how things go. Because I think people see stuff on TV and they get super freaked out about what trials are going to be like, and it's not always like that. Then it's important to prep the victims and make sure that they know, as prosecutors, I can tell them the questions I'm going to ask them. And I can also tell them the likely questions the defense is going to ask them. And I let them know I can't, I may not be able to read their mind, but here are the likely things to be ready for. If people are prepared, they go in, they feel confident. Make sure also that victims have good clothes that they feel comfortable in. If they want to wear makeup, let them wear makeup, maybe not as much as they might normally wear, but the most important thing is to empower the victim to feel confident that people are going to listen to them when they tell their story. There's a lot of unexpected things that happen in human trafficking trials that I never had on any of my other trials. There's a lot of emotion. Sometimes family members can get a little loud. Try to prepare the family for that as well. And a good victim advocate or advocate for the victim can help talk to the family about what to expect. And in some instances, it's just not best for the family to be in the room if they can't control their emotions. Lots of times, victims are very scared to see their trafficker. It takes a long time for cases to go to trial. Sometimes they haven't laid eyes on him or her in 2 years. So in those instances, or their families, if they're worried, well, yes, he or she's going to be in handcuffs, but what about their family? So we had alternate ways for them to enter and exit the courtroom sometimes. We've had law enforcement stand outside the door. You can't do a big show during trial of having a bunch of cops stand around them, but just make sure that you devise a path and surround them in a way that they feel safe during that process. Be prepared if the victim freezes on the stand, what to do. I've had that happen a few times, and sometimes you just need to pause, go back to asking questions that they're going to be comfortable answering, and then gradually back in. But there's nothing worse than having the victim get up there and just shut down. And sometimes that just happens, and then you have to be prepared. In human trafficking cases, lots of defense lawyers find it unseemly to personally attack the victims, so they attack everything else about an investigation. The chain of custody, the whether or not you have the proper business records affidavits to get in hotel records and things, because that's all they can attack. So just make sure you're extra tight on those procedural things to avoid issues. Sentencing. This applies both in federal and state court. victim impact testimony is extremely important. On the federal side, judges do all the sentencing. Make sure that your victim, well before sentencing, has thought about what he or she may want to say. I often get them to write it down. I've had it happen several times where victims write something down and then they get in court and they can't stand up and talk. So I ask the court if it's okay if I read it for them. You just want to make sure that their words are heard and their views are heard. One thing that a lot of victims think that are involved in a trial is, if I mess this up, they're going to go free, or I'm going to put this person in jail for the rest of their life, and they'll have guilt about that. One thing I try to explain to them the whole time through the process is that their job is just to get up there and tell the truth. It is not their job to convict this person. It's not their job. They're not the ones putting them in jail. That is our judicial system. So they're a witness, a very important witness, but a witness just like anyone else. And their job is just to come in and tell the truth. So take some of that burden off their shoulders. In cases where someone has done a guilty plea, I try to make sure the good thing about going to trial is the judge or the jury gets to hear all the nitty-gritty firsthand. In cases where there's a plea, but they either go open to the court, so we don't know, there's not an agreed sentence, or on the federal side, the judges just make the decision. As a prosecutor and investigator, we want to make sure we highlight the most egregious conduct in a concise way for the court to consider in making a decision on the sentencing. Okay, so that is sort of the end of the lessons learned from me part of the presentation. And now I'm going to talk about this great new organization and section that I've had the opportunity to lead. I've been with the Texas AG's office since June 1st of this year. I left the U.S. Attorney's office in mid-May. And part of the reason why I made this move was the amazing opportunities that come with working for the Texas AG's office. As a prosecutor, I'm able to work on things that happen in court, but I'm not able to influence policy for victims that can change their lives after, when they're trying to transition out of being victims, or help create or support harsher punishments for traffickers and things. And so the cool thing about the HTALK section is we have a policy arm, we have a civil arm, and we have a prosecutorial arm. And so I'll talk a little bit about those things now. What kinds of criminal cases do we investigate? Sex trafficking and labor trafficking cases. Our group serves all types of victims: adults, children, domestic and international victims. And we are lucky in that we can do cases anywhere in the state of Texas, and we can do them in state court or federal court. However, one thing that's different about us than the U.S. Attorney's Office or someone who works for the DA's office is we have to be invited in by the criminal prosecutions group, either the federal AUSA's office or the DA's or county attorney's office, to assist in investigations. We don't have original jurisdiction to go into Dallas County and go into a Dallas County grand jury. They'll have to invite us to be brought in. So let's talk a little bit about the different groups we have. We have a criminal prosecution unit, and we have 4 criminal attorneys and are slated to get some more criminal attorneys in the near future. We have a victim advocate. We actually lost our wonderful victim advocate a couple weeks ago to another agency. She may actually be listening right now, to another state agency, TASA, but we are in the process of hiring, and we have some great applicants for that position, and our group has a legal assistant. The cool thing about our prosecutions unit is that we recently moved north of downtown, and our offices are now at 183 and 35 in Austin, and we are co-housed with our criminal investigations unit. The AG's office has a prosecutorial side of the house, and they have the Attorney General's office's law enforcement. So our CID human trafficking unit is co-housed with our prosecutions and human trafficking prosecutions unit, which is really neat because so often in jurisdictions where they may be low on resources, they don't have a lot of criminal investigators, they may not have a lot of experience doing human trafficking cases. And when those law enforcement officers call us, we can send both prosecutors and cops to their communities to help them work on human trafficking cases. And we've had a couple of great opportunities in the last month to do that. We're working a joint case, CID and our prosecutions unit is working a joint case with some federal and local agencies in the Tyler area right now. And recently we just went and met an area outside of Killeen with Coryell County. So these are great opportunities to go into places that need help and bring both the cops and the attorneys to help. Something that was really new to me, which I think is awesome, we also have a civil litigation unit. We have 2 attorneys, we have an investigator and a civil legal assistant. And there are actually a lot of civil opportunities in human trafficking cases to sue traffickers. What is the heart of human trafficking? Why do people do this? They do this usually for money. Whether it's labor trafficking cases and employers want to not pay their employees or pay their employees very, very little so that they can reap extra profits. In labor trafficking cases, whether that's they want to have someone, basically a domestic servant in their house and not pay them. There's a financial motive in labor trafficking as well as in sex trafficking. Why do people pimp out other people? Well, they don't want to work themselves and they can make $1,000 a day off of somebody else having sex for money, and that money all goes to them. So if we look at the motivation for traffickers, in certain cases it can be hard for various reasons against the traffickers. So we have this mechanism by which we can sue them and shut their business down. We can sue them and recover damages. And so that's a really cool opportunity that our agency has. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We have a policy attorney. She is very well versed in how things work in Austin and how we head up, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but we head up a statewide task force, and our policy attorney is awesome. She's helping us work with a bunch of different states on making sure that we devise the best policies and practices in the state to help victims. And we also have 2 great program specialists who work on all kinds of special initiatives, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. So as I mentioned, in criminal prosecutions, the cool thing is we can work in any criminal court, federal or state, in the state. However, we can't just walk in there on our own. People have to ask us. So partnership is extremely important in what we do. There's 2 different ways we can get brought in to a state court prosecution. We can either be asked to partner with the county, where we would be co-counsel with them, or there are certain instances where the district attorney or county attorney has to be recused. They have a conflict. And in those cases, they'll bring us in and we will stand in the place of the DA. Also, recently, we've been asked to do more federal work. And so I'm right now going through the process to become a special assistant U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of Texas to work on a case out in Tyler that I mentioned. And in those instances, we can work side by side with federal prosecutors. Where do we get our referrals? They come in all kinds of places. We try to partner as much as possible with local sheriff's offices, local police departments. Texas DPS is a great partner of ours. And the same with all the federal agencies, HSI, FBI, ATF. And then also we've gotten a decent amount of referrals that came in from NGOs and charity organizations. Sometimes they'll run across a client that they're serving, and as they hear the client's story, they'll contact us to say, I think this could be a criminal case. And so in those instances, we have law enforcement follow up with those people. Okay, so we have victim advocates. When we do have victims that come through on the civil or criminal side, we have ways to connect them with various victim services providers. We also work with the governor's office and their care coordination. We can help with any of that. The governor's office has done huge strides in trying to establish care coordination and CSA stuff going across the state. And so we are always happy to help any way we can in those instances. I think I talked a little bit already about civil litigation. We have a civil statute that allows us to sue traffickers on behalf of the state of Texas. And we have some pretty cool pre-lawsuit discovery capabilities on the civil side that don't exist in a typical civil case. So we can do investigations full-fledged civil investigations prior to filing lawsuits. And we've been working with all different state agencies to help get ideas and leads on civil litigation. So when I first came, I wasn't sure what an IMB was. That's an illicit massage business. We have, the last I heard, the statistic was we have 1,200 illicit massage businesses, which are basically brothels in the state of Texas. I think that number is up and down, but that's a pretty consistent number. We have over 1,000 of them in the state of Texas, and we cannot charge our way out of that problem or sue our way out of that problem. So something our civil group is working on now is something called our Landlord Initiative Program, where we are going to be reaching out to various cities and different sized cities and towns to contact landlords who own the properties where these illicit massage businesses are working out of, to let them know that there may be illegal activity and prostitution and possibly human trafficking happening at their properties. There's a lot of different ways. If a landlord doesn't want that kind of criminal activity happening at their location, they have legal ways to evict basically the brothel from their location. And so that's a really cool project that we've been working on lately that I think is going to get some traction and hopefully get some buy-in from landlords that don't want to be sort of inadvertently facilitating human trafficking at their property. The policy side. So we are part of, all right, so we have a big statewide task force that's legislatively mandated. The task force meets twice a year, and then we also have 3 regional task force meetings, and that's made up of many, many, many players in the state of Texas. Within that task force, there's a smaller nine agency coordinating council that serves as sort of the leadership of the task force, and we have tons of stuff going on the policy side. The last legislative session, there was a House Bill 3800 that addressed a lot of different human trafficking issues, and one of the things the legislature asked us to help do was figure out just how bad is the human trafficking problem in Texas. And so we've been working with DPS and several other partners to try to gather law enforcement statistics to talk about case prosecutions, numbers of defendants, types of charges that are going on the state level in Texas. And so we're in the midst of collecting that data. We also provide witness testimony during the legislature on bills related to human trafficking. So that's a really neat opportunity that our office has to go and speak on behalf of, our knowledge on human trafficking to help the legislature understand whether a bill will be beneficial or not that may provide extra resources for human trafficking. A little bit more about the task force. There's about 60 agencies in the larger task force. We're the chair of it. As I mentioned, that meets twice a year, and we also host 3 regional meetings. We work with a lot of local human trafficking coalitions as well. We do a quarterly newsletter that is actually very well done. It has a lot of good information. It's a good sort of quick refresher on what else is going on statewide in the human trafficking realm. The coordinating council has 9 state agencies that are part of it, and they form the leadership of the human trafficking task force. We recently developed, the legislature asked us to develop a 5-year strategic plan to combat human trafficking statewide. I put this website up there. If you get on the Texas Attorney General's website and look up 5-year human trafficking strategic plan, they'll take you to that link if you're interested. It's about a 60-page document. What other things do we do with special initiatives? We do a lot of training. We also, our group in and of itself can't necessarily do every single training request that comes in, but we also help try to facilitate. If we aren't able to do it ourselves for budget reasons or travel restriction reasons, we will forward those training requests onto local agencies that can help them train. I mentioned before that one of the things that I really felt like as a prosecutor that we needed to have in the state of Texas was a website or a series of websites that someone could go to make sure to find out what services are available for a victim. Let's say I have an adult victim who speaks Spanish, who wants to get their GED. So we're working with the governor's office to devise a website in the future where people can use that and can help navigate all the different charity opportunities that there are in Texas and to help serve victims. We do a lot of exhibits and outreach. A big part of human trafficking awareness is bringing information and training about trafficking to the general public. There's a lot of human trafficking that happens in plain sight in our community, and the more the public knows about it, the better. We've worked with a lot of different organizations in the past, the Buffett McCain Institute, Truckers Against Trafficking. We did a citywide immersive training. This was before I got here in Beaumont, that went very, very well, where we basically went into Beaumont and trained anybody there in the public that wanted training, received training there. And we're also looking for new opportunities and partnerships for that going forward. So if you think that's something that your agency or your city would be interested in working with us on, we'd love to hear from you on that. There is a great video, it's pretty long, but it's worth it, called Be the One, that was created, I believe, in 2017, that talks about, it's very motivating because it talks about how members of the community and the public have helped combat trafficking. And it talks about true cases, and it has victim interviews and things in there that are really great. So there's a link to it on Vimeo, but if you Google Be the One Texas Attorney General, you can find it on YouTube and some other locations. I would definitely, if you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to look at it. We also have different pamphlets and brochures. So if you or your agency wants something to hand out on human trafficking issues, definitely contact us. These two women down below, Tiffany Lee and Katie Drake, are experts in these areas. Those are our two program specialists. So feel free to reach out to either one of them if you have questions or need any kind of promotional materials on having to do with human trafficking. Okay, so now how to do on time. Pretty good. Okay, anybody have any questions?
Yeah, so I'm looking in the chat, Kara. There's just one or two questions here. Have one about IMBs. Have you specifically worked on IMB cases? Like, would that be something you'd be able to help other prosecutors with?
Yes. So okay, so twofold. Me personally, yes. I have worked several IMB cases on the federal side, and I've helped a lot with devising search warrants, devising ways to help both work those cases investigatively and handle them as they're executing search warrants and interviewing victims. Yes. And then when it comes, also our civil practitioners are actively working on some IMB investigations and cases now in the unit. So absolutely, if you have these going on in your community and you want to brainstorm or have some ideas of, want some help on that, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to help.
Great, great. And then I didn't hear you talk, I might have missed it, but did you mention the role of expert witnesses? Something that's needed? And can you talk about that just for a second?
Yes, and I did not mention that, Andrew. I'm sorry, I left that out. So there are two types of expert witnesses that I often use in trials, and it sometimes depends on the facts, but I try to designate them in every case and then decide as the case progresses whether it's needed. There are two types. There's a psychological counseling part of it, and then there's also a law enforcement expert witness that I tend to designate, especially in sex trafficking cases. So it is often hard for juries and judges to understand the trauma bonds that occur between traffickers and victims. And so it can be helpful to use a psychologist or a counselor to explain why victims don't leave. Because when you talk to an average person in the public, whether it's a child victim or an adult victim, whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking, they don't understand why, if they're in a bad situation, they don't walk out the door. And so it can often be helpful. Sometimes the victims themselves can explain it pretty well, and it comes across as easy to understand, and we don't have to have that counselor or psychological expert explain it. But in other instances, either that victim is so fragile that that's not something that I necessarily want to go in with them on. I just wanted to tell their story and get off the stand. But I've worked with some great ones. I know there's many other great ones out there who can get up and explain about how it's almost like a Stockholm syndrome mixed with a domestic violence situation, and it's very unique, and how traffickers purposely use and coerce and manipulate people into believing that they are not free to go. I had a federal judge in Dallas who's a very well-respected and very reserved man talk about one time during a sentencing that I had, when the defense lawyer was attacking the credibility of the victim and saying, you shouldn't believe her, she's just a prostitute type argument. The defense lawyer thought that was a good argument to make at sentencing. And the judge looked at him and said, just because you can't see the chains on the victim doesn't mean that they're not there. So we can use experts to get to that point. And I was so impressed with the judge saying that, especially because he hadn't had a lot of experience in these kind of cases. But yeah, so there's that half of the expert witnesses that can be very, very helpful. And then the other half would be, especially in the sex trafficking world, there's a lot of terminology that gets used. And social media plays a big role in recruiting in sex trafficking cases. They also do a lot of bragging through social media, and they use a lot of words that normal people don't understand what they mean. So I will often designate a law enforcement officer. I try to do a law enforcement officer who's very to work for a different agency, so they go in just completely independent, and I'll have them review social media posts and messages and say, what does this mean? When he says, I'm out here making all my money AOB, what does that mean? Oh, well, that means I make all my money all off a bitch. Well, what does that mean? That means he's bragging about being a pimp. Those kinds of things. And again, sometimes victims are great at explaining that to a jury, but I don't want to have a victim on the stand and have them go over 20 social media posts their trafficker made while they were trafficking them. So, it just depends. But the two types of witnesses that I've used, and that testimony is very well received.
Awesome, thank you. So we've got 1 minute left. If anybody has any questions, put them in the chat. And Tara, we have a special request to the slide with the emails for resources and trainings. If you could show the slide again.
Which one? I'm sorry. Which slide?
The slide emails for resources and training.
Oh yes. With AIDS, I want to have that. They're the most important. Yeah. This one. Yes, they're the most important. To link with if you need any kind of assistance or resources, those links will get it done.
Okay, and we're getting lots of comments from people that this has been very helpful. Reminder that you will get a short evaluation when you log off. Please fill that out. It helps us bring good programming to you. And next month, we have something September 10th, we will be talking about harmful versus healthy dance for children and how dance has become something where kids are often objectified sexually, and it really harms their mental and emotional well-being. So something I came across at the Nicosi Summit that I thought was fascinating, and so I hope you will too. Thank you so much, Kara. This was great. I think you have a lot of new fans in the state. I'm seeing lots of great comments. So thanks for doing this for us, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.